Welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the battleground state of Nebraska. Nebraska has a Senate race here that is really untraditionally, this election season, a competitive state for the first time in a very long time. The state of Nebraska has been a state that Republicans and Democrats have never really thought about or concerned themselves about unless it came down to Nebraska Second District, the district that contains Omaha and routinely swings back and forth between Democrats and Republicans when it comes down to their one electoral vote. But never really did we see any discussion over the past 2 decades of an investment from national Democrats to win a statewide race in Nebraska. With limited exceptions of strong, popular Democratic incumbents in the governor races, Democrats really haven't had much luck when it comes down to Nebraska, with the exception of very, very few circumstances. Not only the governor races, rather more focused, not governor, I meant to say Senate race, with an incumbent who left office in 2012. But looking at Nebraska and this election cycle in specific, this race was never meant to be a competitive one. It's between Republican Senator Deb Fischer, who's the elected incumbent, has been here for 2 terms now seeking a 3rd term, against not a Democrat, but rather an independent Dan Osborne, who's running in the state, who has a particularly strong strength when it comes down to many of the areas that recently went for Deb Fischer and Republicans in practically every previous election. And a big reason why this is even happening in the first place, we have to take a step back and look at what happened in Nebraska in the first place to even allow an independent to get this far in a general election. The state of Nebraska, this cycle, decided on the Democratic side to not run a Democratic challenger in their primary. Instead, they worked with Dan Osborne that he would be their replacement candidate alongside running as an independent on his own. It's a similar strategy playbook that we've seen Democrats employ in some of these battleground districts and battleground states where, in extenuating circumstances, not even battleground districts and battleground states, rather safe states, where they try to take away from that Democratic brand and give an independent the Democratic support combined with the support from independents that aren't all on board with the Republican incumbent. Even if they were faced against a Democrat, they would choose that Republican. So essentially what you're looking at here are conservative voters that are looking for a change that would never vote for a Democrat, but instead would vote for an independent. And so Democrats decided they were going to not run anyone. Dan Osborne was going to be their guy. They were going to endorse him, and he was going to make it to the general election. And so that happened. Deb Fischer became the Republican nominee for Senate. Dan Osborne ran as an independent, and it's pretty much a race between the two in this cycle. Now, to start off, the race never really was that competitive from the beginning. You can take a look at my prediction number from back in, you can see this is January 1st, 2024. Nebraska wasn't even on the radar for competitive states. We were talking about Ohio and Arizona and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, even Florida and Texas. But Nebraska today stands to be one of the closest races when it comes down to polling data, which you might find to be quite interesting, showing Republicans with just a 0.6% advantage. According to FiveThirtyEight, Nebraska, of all of the states, is actually the closest race this election cycle. And again, continuing down that road here, 1 point advantage here, it wasn't always like this, right? Remember those numbers back in January. This is even the number point from September, early September 2024. Nebraska still wasn't on the radar for us. It still wasn't there as a state that was surprisingly more competitive, even though we had heard some rumblings about it. Only recently have we heard that it is very substantive that Nebraska is competitive. And you know what told it off? Was the internal polling that was leaked in the Republican Party in this state that found that the race in Nebraska was tightening in a way that really nobody had ever really expected. They pointed out that Nebraska was a state where Deb Fischer was going to do some damage when it came down to this race. That, Nebraska was a state that never really was on the radar, and then more polling came out showing Nebraska in this competitive race. You can see that the only polls here have been internals, and on both sides they're showing contrasting results, but one thing is clear, it's close and competitive. The most recent Survey USA poll today released shows Dan Osborne at that 50% number, a number that neither candidate, not even the Republican incumbent senator, has reached, which is 50% across the state. Dan Osborne has increased from a 1-point lead early in September, now in early October, a 6-point lead. The lead is tightening for the Republican Party compared to what they got in 2020, or not even 2020, sorry, 2018. And then looking at this cycle, chances are the Democrats and the independents combined vote share might actually be higher than the Republican Party altogether. And now I'm not going to get lost in this in saying that I think Nebraska today ends up being a state that Republicans will lose. I still think Deb Fischer is going to win this Senate race. But the fact is that this could be one of the closest races of the election cycle, and it flew completely over the radar. You can see it in all the conversations around what we're finding to be the most interesting part about this is that Dan Osborne isn't publicly a Democrat, publicly liberal. He doesn't adopt the liberal ideology, the leftist ideology. He is not on that side of the political spectrum. Do I think he's more Republican than Democrat? I really don't know. But what I do know is that he's been a registered independent his entire life. He has a backstory that backs up this idea of bipartisanship and being middle of the road. And on top of that, too, he has never once committed to caucusing with the Democratic Party. That is unlike every other independent that we have seen in recent history, with the exception of Evan McMullin. We'll talk about him in just a moment. But Angus King, didn't make it clear, but when he was elected, chose the Democrats, right? Bernie Sanders, someone who is very much heralded as this massive progressive on the Democratic side, he actually is a registered independent who first was elected to Congress in the House of Representatives from Vermont as an independent, moved over to the Senate as an independent, caucused with the Democratic Party during the duration of his time in Congress, present day still a registered, affiliated Democrat through the caucus. And so Dan Osborne did not go down that pathway. Why? Because Nebraska is a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by a very massive amount. Nebraska went to Trump by 58.2% of the vote to Joe Biden's 39.2%. So he's at a 19-point deficit from 2020. And 2024 might end up even better for Trump than 2020. So looking at that, a 19-point delta that he needs to overcome. Everyone thought it was impossible. You can see it today. Stands to be a lot more possible. And there's a combination of factors here that make me also realize the Republican Party is addressing this as well, too. A new GOP Super PAC announced that they are now hitting the airwaves in Nebraska's Senate race. You don't invest in races that you know you're going to win. You don't invest in races that you know are not going to go to the opposition party with 100% certainty. And for a long period of time, Nebraska simply was that. And Deb Fischer has more money than Dan Osborne. Granted, as a national party, right, the Republicans can invest a lot more to Deb Fischer. They have a little bit left over that they can say, okay, Deb Fischer is going to get our money. She's going to be the one who's getting this to the finish line, pushing us past the point where you can win, pushing us past the point where you're going to be elected. These are all things that are possible. With Dan Osborne, he's not affiliated with National Democrats. He's not in a position where he's going to be, running up the numbers on all of these different sites the Democrats have been able to do in other elections because they have Democrats that have won their primaries, supported the state party, X, Y, and Z. Dan Osborne is on his own, and the money really does show it. Granted, the last report has been done in June. I'm sure more money has been raised on both sides. Republicans are likely still outpacing the independent candidate here quite tremendously. But the fact is, they are investing in a Senate race in a Trump plus 19 state, which really should just go to show how competitive this race has actually become. And to better emphasize this point too, you can look at the race to the White House forecast here, which actually has shown Nebraska now as a competitive state for the first time in a long time. And you can see that their polling average actually has Dan Osborne ahead by 2.8%, but the projected lead in their forecast, which is a lot more realistic than just what polls are saying, Nebraska is only a tilt Republican state for the first time ever. And you can see it. When they started off in this forecast, let's say a year ago, I know it's not a perfect example, but let's track it. A year ago, Nebraska gave Deb Fischer had 98% chance of winning. Over time, it reduced. You saw it go down to roughly 91% in April. It dipped down to 86% in May. Went back up by the time we had reached the end of August. You were looking at a 93% chance of victory. Today, what are we at? Democrats are at a 30.3% chance of victory. Republicans at 69.7%. So 69.7% projected lead, 5.1% advantage for Republicans. That's massive. If the Democrats have genuinely a 1 in 3 chance of, taking this seat from Republicans, and I say Democrats because Dan Osborne, although he has not publicly come out and specifically endorsed one side of the aisle, chances are he'll affiliate with the Democratic Party as the party that backed him and got him in there in the first place. He'd likely be even more conservative than Joe Manchin or Kyrsten Sinema when it came down to votes, but still will be a numbers game there. And anyway, too, even if Democrats don't get that number, I'm sure they'd look at this as a win in ousting someone who's more extreme than Dan Osborne. Dan Osborne, on every single issue is going to be someone that votes to the left of Deb Fischer, even if he doesn't affiliate as a Democrat. But besides that point, too, again, there is a clear opportunity here that did not exist 6 months ago and was not even on our radar until as of recently. And so all of these things really come into our level of understanding about our Senate races. What's competitive? What's not competitive? What's going to be the close race? What's going to be the dark horse race? Nebraska has proven itself to be the dark horse race. Another big thing, too, that I think really informs my decision around Nebraska, or not even informs my decision, might inform us As to why this race is so competitive, you have to look no further than Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, where right now Democrats, despite losing across the state by 18.4%, when it comes down to the 2nd district, Kamala Harris holds on average roughly a 9-point advantage in the district. And according to the numbers here, in Nebraska's 2nd, an 86% chance that Kamala Harris wins the 2nd district, and a projected vote margin here of roughly 7 points. So a 7-point margin. A lot of investments from national Democrats, too. You can see that they are spending millions of dollars in Nebraska's 2nd. Republicans and the Trump team are spending absolutely nothing so far in Nebraska's 2nd. That absolutely is narrowing up and tightening up the race. There are probably no Harris voters out there choosing Deb Fischer over Dan Osborne, but there likely are plenty of the Trump supporters out there that are choosing Donald Trump, but also Dan Osborne, because he isn't affiliated with a party. He's, someone who is publicly and privately has been an independent for his entire life, and he really brings in this, conservative vote share of people who would never vote for Kamala Harris, but would be willing to vote for an independent candidate for U.S. Senate just to send a message to the mainstream GOP. And that is the type of person that he's really trying to lean into, and it actually might pull out ahead and might actually work. The Harris campaign is focusing on winning that 2nd district. They're focusing on winning that congressional district. They want the numbers out of Nebraska 2nd to benefit them just in terms of electoral vote count and in terms of potentially, should they win the election, governing out of Nebraska 2nd district. You win Nebraska 2nd, you're one more seat away from the 4 needed to win the House majority in 2024. So a lot of investments, a lot of time being spent in that district there, and that is undeniably advancing Dan Osborne by driving up Democratic vote share in an area where Democrats really think that's the only place they can have an impact. Now in the Senate race, they have been handed this advantage, not advantage, but this opportunity that puts them in a position where they could genuinely be in a strong position to win a Senate race without a Democratic candidate and against a Republican incumbent who had already been elected twice in the state of Nebraska. And when we look at our Senate map here, I'm not going to fill it out for you. We're not going to, spend too much time looking at this map here, but the math here becomes much more difficult for Republicans should they lose the state of Nebraska. Obviously, it's not a guarantee. It probably isn't going to happen. I'd bet today that Deb Fischer is going to win. I'd say she wins by more than 5 points, but that's not good enough for a Republican candidate, and I think it speaks to a larger problem that we have seen not only in Nebraska, because that isn't the only state that has a Senate race this cycle, but in states like Arizona, where you're choosing bad candidates who can't perform well, who can't poll well, who can't fundraise well. You're not going to see those states flip. You're not going to see Republicans flipping Nevada. That just simply isn't going to happen. Sam Brown is going to win there. Right? Ruben Gallego is going to win in Arizona. Democrats are going to win both of those seats. You've seen consistently Republicans don't have what it takes to win those races. Why? They have bad candidates on the GOP side. Sam Brown, who ran to the right of Adam Laxalt in the 2022 primary, all of that stuff is coming back to hurt him. He's being labeled as an extremist. He's being attacked. He's being brandished as this person who is far too right-wing for the voters in Nevada. Same thing with Kari Lake, who very publicly still holds many of these beliefs. Sam Brown at least has tried to walk it back, especially on the issue of abortion. You have not seen that being the case when it comes down to Kari Lake in Arizona. Same thing you're seeing across the country. Dave McCormick was not a stellar recruit in the state of Pennsylvania. Another Republican could have won it. This time we're not going to see that happen, more likely than not. Right? You see Eric Hovde, not the best recruit. All across the board, not the best recruits. Is going to be this reminding force for Republicans should they lose. Should they lose many Senate races, and should they lose Nebraska, it's done deal, right? If Democrats, Dan Osborne and the independent candidate there wins Nebraska's Senate race, Kamala Harris is president and Democrats have control of the Senate. And that's where we are. That is something that probably isn't going to happen in totality. Nebraska will probably be one of the last states the Democrats really do win when it comes down to swing states in the Senate races here, but it's still within contention. And the fact remains, a non-Republican candidate holds a 1 in 3 chance of winning in the state of Nebraska for the first time in a tremendously long time. And that can do really substantive things for the Democratic Party in drawing away money from races that might be able to be nudged over if Republicans had the additional $10 million that they're willing to spend in Nebraska. Had Democrats, Republicans been investing this time, investing these resources anywhere. But because Democrats and independents together have come together and made this race one that is more competitive, made this race one that Democrats can now look at and say, we can win here. They looked at 2022 as this blueprint where Evan McClellan ran against Mike Lee as an independent. The Democrats decided not to run anyone. What we found here was the margin in Utah ended up being roughly 11 points. Mike Lee faced serious backlash for his association with Donald Trump. Voters responded accordingly on Election Day. Although the majority of voters did elect Mike Lee, this is the worst electoral performance for Republicans since 1974 in the Senate races. So Mike Lee running against an independent, really bad look here. The thing about Utah is the margins are nearly identical to that of Nebraska in 2020. So I'm very interested to see what happens in this time. I do think that we're going to see Deb Fischer win. I do think, though, it's a really big, warning sign for Republicans that similar things like this might arise in the future. Copycat candidates that are independents that with the backing of the Democratic Party and swaying over some swing voters here might actually give these Republicans a run for their money. Because as of right now, that's exactly what's happening in Nebraska. And for the first time in a very long time, Nebraska is a swing state on the Senate level. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election, Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.